Okay, I'm going to continue talking about Matt Bogas and his family in the Stony Ridge area, Lomax area of Trap Hill. But before I can talk about his 12 children, I want to go back to a picture that we ended on in the previous video. This picture here taken inside of his house. I want to mention this chair. This chair, the chair that Deemy's sitting in, it appears in 3 different pictures that I have. You can recognize it by the front of the chair here and this carving that's in the front. And in this picture, in another picture, Deemy is standing beside it. And then in a third picture, there's a baby sitting in the chair. And I can only assume that that's one of Matt's children. Don't know which one. But I just wanted to mention this chair because it's a prominent part of 3 pictures that I have. Okay, now I want to talk about Matt's children, starting with his 6 daughters. The oldest daughter is Molly. And Molly was born in 1895, and she never married. She lived alone from the time she moved out of her parents' house till into the 1980s when she moved to a nursing home. But she farmed on several plots of land in the area, and she helped look after her nieces and nephews, and she's well remembered in the neighborhood, in the community. The next daughter is Betty. Betty married Romus Billings, shown here, in 1921. They were neighbors to Matt. The Billings family here were neighbors to the Bauguess family up along Stony Ridge School Road. And so they lived very close to where Betty and where Romus grew up. And this is their their oldest son, their first son, Wallace. The next daughter is Deemy. And once again, here you see, here's this chair with the carving leg here. So once again, Deemy's in 2 of these pictures with the chair. She married Clayton Blackburn in the 1930s, and they lived not too far away to the east of where she grew up. Next daughter is Sally. Sally married Ernest Beeson. Here he is. And they moved to Winston-Salem. The next daughter is Tracy. She married George Myers, and they moved to Greenville, South Carolina. And the youngest of the 12 children is daughter Wanis. And here Wanis is shown with her mother, Julie Pruitt Bauguess, and with Wanis's niece and Julie's granddaughter, Audrey Bauguess. Wanis married Roy Prevett, and they lived just a couple miles to the west of where Wanis grew up. All right. Here's 2 pictures, group photos of children. I'll run through their names. This is son Frank, daughter Molly, son Charlie, Deemy, Jack. Let's see, and this is Sally and Tracy. Daughter Wanis was probably, if she was born at the time, she was just a baby. So she was born, I believe, in 1922. So this picture was probably taken about that time. And in this other picture here is Molly, son Sherd, and Deemy again. These pictures were taken at the same time on the road just behind Matt's house. I want to put in perspective here the situation that Matt and Julie were faced with. Their sons were in and out of court almost continuously from the 1920s into the late 1930s. And that had to be exhausting, I guess, if nothing else, for Matt, because one or more of his sons were either in jail, in prison, or going to court trying to decide whether they'd be paying a fine or having some jail time. I want to run through just a few of the court cases, examples of what they were up to during this time. Here in 1927, Fisher, Charlie, Frank. So here's Charlie, and here's Frank, and then Fisher. He's in one of these other pictures, but they were charged with reckless driving. The charge against Fisher was dropped, but the others pled guilty and were sentenced to 4 months in jail. So that's, maybe 3 years after this picture was taken. Here on the same date, actually, they were charged with disturbing a public gathering. Frank and Charlie, again, were in violation of the prohibition law. Fisher, Charlie, Archie Pruitt, who was a cousin, and Frank were charged with disturbing a public gathering. Here in December of 1927, once again, Frank and Charlie were charged with disturbing a religious congregation. You can only imagine what that would have been like. In that case, it was continued into 1928, and the court record read, "It appearing to the court that the cost of this and other cases against these defendants amount to over $100, it is recorded by the court that the judgment in this case heretofore rendered be stricken out." So the court figured these guys have been paying all year long for different crimes they've committed. They've paid enough. They paid over $100. That's not working. It's almost like they gave up. Here in 1929, so a couple years later, Charlie Bauguess was charged with operating a car while under influence of intoxicants. So it sounded like Charlie got a 1929 DWI for driving while intoxicated. And really, Charlie and Fisher in particular, and then especially Charlie, throughout the 1930s, here's charges against Charlie for larceny, another one in 1935 and in 1937. 1938, he was found guilty of various cases. The document I found didn't elaborate. But it sounded like Charlie had a hard time behaving, and that just, you can only imagine what that was like for their parents. Give one example here. Charlie died in 1941 in a car wreck, and in just a couple months after he died, Matt went to court, and I'll read a little bit about this. June of 1941. Matt brought a case before the Wilkes Superior Court. As administrator of the estate of Charlie Bauguess, he brought charges against Arnold Bird, Sant Bird, and Sam Bird. Because of his poor financial state, he was allowed to sue as a pauper. The next year, in January 1942, a jury found that Charlie's death was not caused by the negligence of Arnold Bird, and that the plaintiff, Matt, was not entitled to any damages. So what it sounds like Matt took the Bird family to court, blaming them for Charlie's death. So my guess is what happened was Charlie was in a car with the three of them. Probably Arnold Bird was driving, wrecked. Charlie was killed, and Matt wanted to hold them responsible, and have them pay for damages or some kind of retribution. But it sounds like the court saw otherwise, and he didn't win the case. So that's just an example of all the turmoil and distress that he was going through during that time, with all the troubles his sons were in. All right, so I'm going to move on and talk about them individually now, briefly. This is the oldest son, John. This is my great-grandfather. He married Verna Engel in 1920, and they lived, again, maybe a quarter mile away from Matt, so in the same general area, along the same stretch of road. And the next son is Fish. Interesting story about him. He was married 2 or 3 times. Not really sure, because the records are kind of faint or vague in his case. Somebody told me his first wife may have been a Hawkins, but that didn't work out. This person told me that he was probably drunk when he got married, and the next day he realized what he had done, and he was probably still drunk, and he tried to bury his first wife. So that wasn't a good idea. Obviously, that marriage didn't last. And then within a couple years, he remarried again to Ona McCann. And by 1930, they were separated. And I think they were divorced in 1931 officially. And he may have married again, but eventually he moved to Winston-Salem, where he lived until he died in the 1970s. So that's Fish. Next son is Sherd, or Shirley, but most people refer to him as Sherd. He married Bertie Pruitt. She was a school teacher in the area, and they were practically neighbors to Matt. So they lived just across the valley. They had 2 children. And then this is Charlie again. I talked about him. He died in 1941 in a car wreck, and seemed like he stayed in trouble. Stayed in trouble with the law. Next son is Frank. He never married either, most likely because he died young. He died of pneumonia in 1934. In 1930, though, he and Charlie were in the Chillicothe, Ohio census. And they were clearly, they were in Chillicothe, Ohio in prison because that was a popular place that they sent Wilkes County violators of the Prohibition law. So both Charlie and Frank were there in 1930 as a result of some of their convictions earlier. The youngest son was Jack. And this is him in the middle with brother Frank on the left. And I don't know who this is on the right. At one time thought it might be Sherd. It kind of looks like him, but I'm not so sure now. So he may be a relative, a friend, a neighbor. I'm just not sure. Maybe somebody will recognize him and let me know who that is. But I always like this picture because Jack has some kind of animal draped over his shoulder, maybe a fox or something. Jack, he also died in 1934 along with Frank of pneumonia. Okay, so there's the 6 sons. Here's a picture of Matt when he was a little older, probably in the 1940s, maybe as late as 1950. Probably 1940s though. He lived in this same house, you can see the edge of it here, until the 1950s when he moved to South Carolina to live with his daughter Tracy. And you can tell this is the same porch where in the picture at the beginning of the first video, here's his chair on the porch and he's sitting in his chair right there on the porch looking into the sun. So this is Matt in his driveway. And here is Matt again in living color. It's the only color picture that I have of Matt. And this was taken in 1956 or maybe 1957 at Christmas when he came up from South Carolina to spend a few weeks visiting family, including his daughter Betty. So this is Betty and her husband Romus Billings. And all the children here are Betty and Romus's grandchildren. So that would be Matt's great-grandchildren. So in this picture, Matt is 90 years old. Or about 90 years old. He died 4 or 5 years later in February of 1961 at the age of 94. And that's what I know about Matt Bogas, my great-great-grandfather.